On the evening of September 21st, 1989, more than 1,000 people gather inside Lincoln High School in McClellanville. They believe the sturdy brick building is the safest place in town, a solid refuge against the storm nearing the coast. The official maps mark the school at 20 feet above sea level, high enough, they trust, to stay dry through any surge. But the maps are wrong, and the truth hidden inside that single error will nearly cost every person inside their life. The building sits barely 10 feet above the ocean, not 20, a quiet mistake that is about to turn shelter into a trap. What the official record rarely tells is how close this small fishing town comes to unimaginable catastrophe tonight. To understand how a simple mapping error becomes a matter of survival, the story must begin far across the Atlantic Ocean. Early in September of 1989, a cluster of thunderstorms drifts off the western coast of Africa and into open tropical water. Warm, humid air feeds the swirling system as it rolls slowly westward, gathering strength with every passing hour. Within days, the storm earns a name, Hugo, and forecasters begin tracking its long march across the open Atlantic basin. In the language of forecasters, the system is upgraded step by step, from depression to tropical storm to hurricane. Ships at sea are warned to steer far clear as Hugo swells into a vast wheel of wind, spanning hundreds of miles. The ocean that autumn runs unusually warm, and warm water is the single fuel that powerful hurricanes crave above all. Hugo grows quickly, its winds climbing past 150 miles an hour as it swells into a Category 5 storm. At its fearsome peak, it becomes one of the strongest systems ever recorded in the wide open waters of the Atlantic. The hurricane barrels toward the Caribbean, where scattered islands lie directly in the path of its rotating core. Guadeloupe feels the first blow, then Montserrat, then the Virgin Islands, each struck in turn by the punishing wind. Across these islands, homes are flattened, harbors ruined, and entire communities are left facing very hard days ahead. Puerto Rico endures the storm next, its power grid crippled, and its coastal towns battered through the long night. On the island of Montserrat, roofs are torn away and the small harbor is left in ruins beneath the screaming wind. For days, much of the Caribbean lies cut off from the world, its airports closed, and its radios silent in the storm. The islands, once known for their beauty, now face a long and uncertain season of clearing wreckage and rebuilding. After crossing the islands, Hugo weakens a little, and some forecasters quietly wonder if the worst has already passed. But the storm turns north toward the mainland and crosses the warm ribbon of the Gulf Stream off the Carolina coast. That current of heated water acts like a second engine, and Hugo draws in fresh energy from the warm sea below it. The system reorganizes and strengthens once more, rising to a fierce Category 4 as it takes aim at South Carolina. Meteorologists watch their screens with growing alarm as the storm refuses to turn safely back out to open sea. The warning is clear, yet no forecast can say exactly where along the coast this powerful hurricane will strike. Satellite images reveal a huge spiral of cloud, its eyes staring like a dark pupil toward the Carolina shoreline. By September 21st, the coastline lies squarely inside the forecast cone, and the clock begins to run down fast. Along the shore, officials issue urgent orders for residents to leave the barrier islands and the low-lying land. Marinas are emptied as boats are hauled from the water, though many are simply left to the mercy of the coming sea. In Charleston, the mayor pleads with citizens to abandon their homes and move inland before the roads fill completely. Many families pack in a hurry and join the long lines of cars crawling west along the crowded coastal highways. Yet others hesitate, remembering past storms that curved away at the last moment and spared their quiet neighborhoods. Some choose to stay, trusting old houses that have weathered decades of weather, unwilling to leave everything behind. The mayor warns that this storm is different, far larger and stronger than anything the region has faced in years. History records that persuading people to flee is one of the hardest tasks any coastal leader will ever confront. Gas stations run dry as thousands fill their tanks, and store shelves empty of water, batteries, and fresh bread. Highway lanes are reversed to speed the flow of traffic, yet the roads still crawl beneath the darkening sky. Hospitals move patients inland, and nursing homes empty their quiet halls in a careful, hurried procession west. Elderly residents weigh the danger of the storm against the exhaustion of a long and crowded journey inland. The choice to go or to stay becomes, for many families, the most consequential decision they have ever faced. Farther up the coast lies McClellanville, a quiet fishing village built around shrimp boats and wide salt marsh. For generations, its people have made their living from the sea, reading the tides and the weather with practiced eyes. As Hugo approaches, families here face a hard choice about where to find safety through the long and coming night. The roads inland are already jammed, and for many, the local high school seems the most sensible place they can go. Over 1,000 residents crowd inside, carrying children, blankets, and whatever they can quickly gather up. They settle into hallways and classrooms, trusting the strong brick walls and the elevation printed on the maps. In gathering here, they had done exactly what the authorities advised, following guidance meant to keep them safe. That trust, so reasonable and so ordinary, is exactly what makes the Lincoln High era haunting in hindsight. As midnight nears, the outer bands of Hugo sweep ashore, and the wind begins to howl through the coastal pines. The storm makes landfall almost exactly at midnight, near Sullivan's Island, just north of Charleston Harbor. Its timing could hardly be worse, for the hurricane arrives precisely at high tide along the vulnerable shoreline. Winds near 140 miles an hour tear across the beaches and drive the ocean hard toward the land. The sea and the sky merge into a single roaring darkness as the full fury of the hurricane reaches the coastline. Then comes the storm surge, a towering wall of seawater pushed steadily ahead of the hurricane's advancing eye. A storm surge is not a single wave, but a dome of water the hurricane pushes ashore with its relentless winds. When that dome arrives exactly at high tide, the two forces combine, and the ocean reaches rarely seen heights. The surge rises above 20 feet, in places the highest ever measured along the entire eastern coast of the nation. Whole islands vanish beneath the water as the sea climbs streets, swallows yards, and pours through every front door. In Charleston, the historic streets flood as the harbor spills over its edges into the heart of the old city. Steeples and rooftops are stripped of their shingles, and the ancient oaks of the battery bow before the wind. The city that had stood for 3 long centuries now endures a night as punishing as any in its long memory. At McClellanville, the ocean the maps promised was safely distant begins to seep under the doors of Lincoln High. At first, it is only a thin trickle across the floor, but within minutes, the water rises with frightening speed. The people inside realize with dawning horror that their refuge sits far lower than the records had ever claimed. In the darkness, the water climbs past ankles, then knees, then waists, as families scramble toward higher ground. Parents lift children onto shoulders and countertops, searching for anything at all above the fast-rising tide. The water inside the building reaches nearly 6 feet, filling classrooms where crowds had gathered for safety. In the pitch black, people climb onto window ledges and cling to whatever they can reach along the flooded walls. Some pry open ceiling panels and pull themselves toward the roof beams, lifting one another up through the gaps. Parents tie children to the rafters with belts and clothing so the churning current cannot pull them into the dark. For hours they hold on above the flood, listening to the roar of wind and water tearing at the trembling building. Above the water, strangers become a single community, calling out names in the dark to be sure none is lost. Time seems to stretch on endlessly as the wind shrieks and the water laps just below the crowded roof beams. No one inside can see the exit, and no rescue can reach them while the storm rages across the drowned coastline. Against every expectation, the walls hold, and the roof stays fixed above the frightened crowd until first light. When dawn finally breaks, the water recedes, and remarkably, not a single person inside the school has lost their life. Their survival is a matter of inches, and luck, a near miss that emergency planners would study for decades after. Outside, the scene that greets the survivors seems to belong to a strange dream rather than the world they knew. Shrimp boats that had floated safely in the harbor now rest miles inland, stranded across roads and open fields. Fishing vessels lie tangled in the trees, dragged by the surge, far from any water they were ever built to sail. Roads have become rivers of mud and debris, and familiar landmarks have simply vanished from the flooded coast. The salt marsh that shaped the village for centuries is scoured and reshaped by the raw force of the vanished sea. But the story of Hugo is far from over, for the storm that struck the coast refuses to behave as anyone expected. Most hurricanes weaken quickly once they cross onto land, starved of the warm ocean water that feeds their winds. Forecasters expect Hugo to fade into a heavy rainstorm within hours of moving inland from the battered shoreline. Instead, the storm races north at nearly 26 miles an hour, far faster than a typical hurricane ever travels. Normally, the friction of hills and forests tears a storm apart, draining its strength within a few short hours. But Hugo moves too fast for the land to slow it, staying strong while its winds remain fierce and destructive. That extraordinary speed carries Hugo deep inland before it can lose the terrible energy stored within its winds. The storm charges across South Carolina through the darkness, its powerful gusts still intact hour after hour. By the early morning, Hugo reaches Charlotte, North Carolina, a full 200 miles from the distant ocean shore. Charlotte is a large inland city, one that had never expected a tropical storm to reach so far from the open sea. Its residents sleep unaware that a hurricane is bearing down on them from a coast most people consider safely away. The wind arrives in the darkness, snapping trees and hurling broken branches through the quiet residential streets. Century-old oaks that had shaded the city for generations crash down onto homes, cars, and tangled power lines. The electrical grid fails across the region as poles topple and transformers burst in sudden showers of sparks. Hundreds of thousands of homes lose their power in a single night, plunging the whole metro area into darkness. At a local television studio, staff broadcast live updates as the storm tears at the very building around them. During the broadcast, the ceiling gives way, collapsing on air as the crew scrambles quickly to safety off camera. The moment captures the shock of an entire city caught completely unprepared for a disaster it never thought could come. By morning, the streets of Charlotte are choked with fallen limbs, and the traffic lights hang dark and useless. Schools and offices close, and a city built far from the sea learns that no place is truly beyond a storm's reach. In the aftermath, hard questions rise about how a modern nation could be so unready for a storm of this scale. The mapping error at McClellanville stands as the starkest failure, a mistake that nearly caused a mass tragedy. Officials had trusted elevation figures that were simply wrong, sending a crowd to a shelter that was far too low. Had the walls given way or the roof lifted off, the loss of life inside that school could have been staggering. The narrow escape forces emergency planners to rethink how shelters are chosen and how their maps are verified. The National Weather Service also faces criticism for underestimating the danger the storm posed so far inland. Few had warned Charlotte residents that a hurricane's fierce winds could reach so deep into the interior at all. The idea that a tropical storm could batter an inland city had simply not entered most people's planning at all. Hugo shatters that assumption and forces forecasters to study how fast-moving storms carry their power far inland. The gap between coastal warnings and inland readiness becomes a subject of careful study for years to come. Emergency officials realize that a warning is only as useful as the plan that stands ready to follow behind it. Yet the sharpest anger falls upon the federal response that unfolds in the difficult days after the storm passes. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, known widely as FEMA, is tasked with coordinating relief across the region. But the agency moves slowly, tangled in paperwork and procedure, while desperate communities wait and wait for help. Weeks pass before aid begins to flow smoothly, and residents, without power or clean water, grow deeply frustrated. Local leaders accuse the agency of drowning the recovery in bureaucracy, rather than delivering swift, needed relief. The criticism is loud and public, and it climbs all the way to the highest levels of the national government. Hugo becomes a lasting case study in how a well-meaning system can fail the very people it was built to protect. Church halls become shelters, and school gyms fill with cots as displaced families wait for power to return. Line crews arrive from distant states, working through rain and heat to raise the poles and string new wire. As the region begins to rebuild, the true scale of the destruction Hugo left behind slowly comes into sharp focus. Vast stretches of forest lie flattened with millions of trees snapped or uprooted across the two Carolinas. Farmers survey ruined fields and toppled barns, counting a harvest and a livelihood swept away in one single night. The timber industry suffers enormous losses, and the wounded forests will take many long years to recover fully. Blackouts stretch on for weeks in some areas, as crews work around the clock to rebuild the shattered power grid. The financial toll climbs into the billions, ranking Hugo among the costliest storms the nation had yet endured. Out of this destruction, though, comes lasting change that reshapes how the whole coast prepares for future storms. South Carolina reviews its building codes and finds them far too weak to withstand a storm of Hugo's raw power. New standards demand stronger roofs, deeper foundations, and homes designed to resist even the fiercest of winds. Over the following years, these tougher codes are adopted across the entire state, rather than one town at a time. Buildings raised after Hugo would stand far better equipped to survive the hurricanes that were sure to follow. The phrase, inland hurricane, enters the public vocabulary, a warning that danger does not simply stop at the shore. Coastal towns rewrite their evacuation maps, marking clearer routes and shelters set on genuinely higher ground. The storm also transforms the way the region thinks about evacuation and the real value of leaving early enough. Officials learn that waiting until the last moment leaves families trapped on the roads with no time left to escape. New plans call for evacuations to begin far earlier, ordered well before a storm ever reaches the vulnerable coast. For the most exposed zones, evacuation becomes mandatory, no longer a mere suggestion left to personal judgment. The old culture of riding out the storm slowly gives way to a new culture of leaving before the danger arrives. Weather agencies invest in better tracking, determined never again to be left guessing where a great storm will go. The insurance industry, too, is forced to reckon with the enormous cost of rebuilding an entire battered coastline. Policies are rewritten and premiums reshaped as companies confront the true risk of living beside the open sea. Insurers map the coastline anew, marking the zones where the sea is most likely to rise in a future storm. The reforms ripple outward, shaping how other states along the vulnerable coast prepare for their own storms. FEMA itself undergoes a deep restructuring in the years that follow, reforming how it responds to great disaster. The failures exposed by Hugo pushed the agency toward faster, better organized aid in the many crises still to come. Slowly, the shattered communities of the Carolinas begin the long and patient work of rebuilding what was lost. Neighbors help neighbors clear fallen trees, patch roofs, and share generators, food, and water in the weeks after. Volunteers pour in from across the country, carrying supplies and offering hands to towns that had lost so much. In McClellanville, the survivors of Lincoln High returned to a village forever marked by the night the sea rose up. Their story spreads across the nation, a stark reminder of how thin the margin between shelter and disaster can be. Engineers revisit the flawed maps and correct the elevation figures that had placed so many lives in real danger. The lesson is written into new procedures, ensuring that no future shelter is ever chosen on faulty ground again. Scientists study Hugo's inland path for years, learning how a fast storm can keep its fury hundreds of miles inland. Researchers give Hugo a firm place in the textbooks, a benchmark against which later hurricanes would be measured. The forests, though flattened, slowly green again, and new growth rises where the old canopy had long stood. Their findings reshape forecasting, so that cities far from the coast are warned when a hurricane may reach them. The images of shrimp boats, stranded on highways, become an enduring symbol of the storm's almost unimaginable force. For the fishing families of the coast, the losses are heavy, yet the sea slowly returns, and the boats sail again. Charlotte, once caught utterly by surprise, rebuilds its tree-lined streets and rethinks its own storm readiness. The city plants new trees and strengthens its grid, preparing for a future that no longer feels safely far from the sea. Across both Carolinas, the memory of Hugo settles deep into the culture, shaping how each generation faces a storm. Parents tell their children of the night the water rose, and of the choices that meant survival or terrible loss. Each anniversary, the communities pause to remember the night the wind and water quietly rewrote the coastal map. The children carried to the rafters that night grow up to tell the story to children of their own in turn. The storm reshapes not only the coastline, but the very way an entire region understands its place beside the ocean. What had once felt like distant, abstract risk becomes, after Hugo, a lived and unforgettable truth for millions. The building codes born from the disaster quietly save countless homes when the next great storms finally arrive. The earlier evacuations, once resisted, come to be seen as ordinary wisdom, rather than an overreaction to danger. In this way, the suffering of one September night is slowly transformed into protection for years still to come. Hugo stands in the record books as one of the defining storms of its era, a turning point in disaster preparation. It changed how a nation builds, how it warns, how it evacuates, and how it answers the call of communities in need. The near tragedy at Lincoln High, so close to catastrophe, becomes a lesson carried forward across the decades. And the corrected maps, the stronger homes, and the earlier warnings all trace their origin to that single storm. The corrected elevation of a single school stands as a quiet monument to a lesson learned the very hardest way. The open question left behind is whether every hard lesson written in that night will truly be remembered in time. For disasters, history shows have a way of fading from memory until the next great storm rises upon the horizon. The people who lived through Hugo know the answer, and they carry its warning quietly into every hurricane season. When the maps were wrong, the sea nearly won, and only inches and courage stood between a town and its ending. That is the true legacy of Hugo, a storm that changed the Carolinas, their coastline, and their people forever. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that the ground we trust most can hide the very danger we believe we have escaped. Each stronger home and each earlier warning is a quiet answer to the question that night so violently asked. The storm has long since passed, yet its mark endures in the codes, the maps, and the memory of two states. And somewhere along that reshaped coast, the salt marsh still whispers of the night the ocean climbed the land. If the story of Hugo teaches anything, it is that preparation, humility, and memory are our surest defense. Explore how other great storms reshaped the places they struck, and the lessons they left for all who followed.